And I exercise every day. I vocalize every day. I, I practice if I'm working.
A new claim has just reignited the oldest conspiracy in rock and roll history, and this time it's not coming from obsessed fans or internet theorists. Resurfaced insider interviews and a fresh investigative deep dive are pointing to something that sounds impossible until you actually look at the evidence. The body lying in Elvis Presley's casket on August 18th, 1977, may not have been Elvis Presley at all. It may have been a custom built wax figure. And before you dismiss that, you need to hear what the people who were actually there had to say, because their words are the reason this story refuses to die. Graceland's front foyer was never designed to hold a funeral, but on that sweltering August afternoon, and it became a makeshift chapel for the biggest farewell the world had ever seen. Over 30,000 people lined up along Elvis Presley Boulevard, some standing for hours in the Memphis heat, just to walk past a copper casket and say goodbye to the man who had given them the soundtrack of their lives. Grown men who had never cried in public wept openly. Women fainted before they even reached the door. There were so many flowers that the smell was almost suffocating, and the air conditioning inside Graceland was fighting a losing battle against the sheer volume of human bodies pressing through that space. It was chaos dressed up as ceremony, and somewhere inside all of that grief and madness, something was very, very wrong. Multiple mourners who filed past that casket walked away saying the same thing, independently. Yeah, without coordinating, without knowing each other. They said the body didn't look like Elvis. Not in the way that death changes a person's face, not in the gentle way that embalming smooths out features. They meant something more specific, more unsettling. The nose looked straighter than Elvis's actual nose. The jawline seemed softer, almost sculpted. The hands resting across the chest were too smooth, too perfect, as if they had never gripped a microphone or wrapped around a guitar neck. These weren't strangers making casual observations from a distance. Some of these people had known Elvis personally. They had looked into his face 100 times, and now they were looking at something that felt like a very good copy rather than the real thing. But the single most disturbing detail didn't come from facial features or hand shapes, and it came from the forehead. Several witnesses, including people close to the family, noticed small beads of moisture gathering on the forehead of the body, droplets sitting on the skin under those bright foyer lights, catching the glow like tiny jewels. Now, here is what you need to understand about that detail. Dead bodies do not sweat. The biological processes that produce perspiration shut down the moment the heart stops. Embalmed bodies, especially, do not produce surface moisture. But you know what does produce moisture? When placed under hot lights in a room with failing air conditioning? Wax. High grade sculpting wax speeds up exactly the way those witnesses described. Exactly. And then there is the weight. Elvis's autopsy report listed the body at approximately 250 pounds. And that number might seem unremarkable until you put it next to what the people closest to Elvis were saying about his physical condition in the final weeks of his life. Friends, band members, members of the Memphis Mafia, they all agreed that Elvis had gained significant weight in those last months. Several of them estimated he was closer to 300 pounds, maybe more. That is not a small discrepancy. That is a 50-pound gap between what the official record says and what the people who saw Elvis alive with their own eyes believe to be true. Either the Shelby County Medical Examiner made a serious miscalculation, or the body on that examination table was not carrying the same weight that Elvis Aaron Presley was carrying when he was last seen alive. So here is where this gets really uncomfortable. If the people who loved Elvis the most couldn't look at that body and feel certain they were seeing the real him, then what exactly happened inside Graceland in the hours between Elvis's reported death and that public viewing? Because what went on behind those closed doors is somehow even stranger than what 30,000 mourners witnessed with their own eyes. Everything we just talked about is based on what other people noticed. The mourners who felt uneasy, the witnesses who couldn't reconcile what they were seeing with the man they remembered. But now we need to shift the lens entirely, because the most haunting evidence in this conspiracy doesn't come from bystanders or skeptics. It comes from Elvis himself. And if you follow the trail he left behind, it starts to look less like a collection of random coincidences and more like a man who signed a confession in breadcrumbs and then waited almost 50 years for someone to pick them up. Start with the gravestone. Walk into Graceland's meditation garden today, and you will find a bronze plaque marking the final resting place of Elvis Aaron Presley. 2 A's in Aaron. It looks perfectly normal until you pull out Elvis's original birth certificate, the one filed in Tupelo, Mississippi, on January 8th, 1935. That document reads Elvis Aaron Presley. 1A, not Aaron. Aaron. Now, Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, reportedly insisted on the double A spelling for the grave marker. The family's public explanation was that Vernon wanted the more biblical version of the name to honor his son properly. And maybe that's true. But conspiracy researchers have been pointing to that single extra letter for decades, and their argument is razor sharp. You cannot engrave a living man's legal name on an empty grave. That is fraud. Then there is the money. Elvis Presley held a multi-million-dollar life insurance policy at the time of his death. The Presley estate was drowning in debt. Graceland itself was a financial sinkhole. The logical, obvious, almost automatic move for any grieving family in that position would be to file the insurance claim immediately. They never did. That policy was never cashed. Not in 1977, not in 1978, not ever. And you have to sit with that for a moment because it defies every rational explanation, unless you consider one possibility that makes it all make sense. Insurance companies do not simply write checks when someone famous dies. They investigate. They send doctors. They examine the body independently. And if the body lying in Graceland's foyer could not survive that level of medical scrutiny, then you do not file the claim. You eat the debt. You keep the secret. You let millions of dollars sit untouched because collecting them would unravel everything. Now layer this on top of something even more chilling. In the weeks leading up to August 16th, 1977, multiple Graceland insiders confirmed that Elvis was reading a stack of books in his private quarters. Most of them were spiritual texts, which was normal for Elvis, but buried in that stack was a book about identity change and disappearance techniques, essentially a manual on how to fake your own death and start over as someone new. Elvis Presley, one of the most recognizable human beings on the planet, was studying how to vanish, weeks before he vanished. And then there was the music. Elvis's final studio album, Moody Blue, was released just weeks before his reported death. Researchers who have gone deep into the track sequencing and lyrical content of that album believe it contains coded farewell messages, almost as if Elvis was using melody and metaphor to say goodbye in the only language the world would let him speak freely. It is not proof, but it is texture. It is a man rapping his final words inside songs because he knew the songs would outlive the silence. Any single one of these details can be explained away on its own. A misspelled name is just a family preference. An unclaimed policy is just an oversight. A book is just a curiosity. An album is just an album. But clues do not exist in isolation. They exist in context, and the context surrounding Elvis's final months involves a cast of characters whose behavior, once you examine it honestly, moves from suspicious to nearly inexplicable, starting with the one man who controlled every breath of Elvis's career, every dollar of his fortune, and possibly every detail of his disappearance. Colonel Tom Parker was not a colonel. He was not even Tom Parker. The man who controlled every dimension of Elvis Presley's life was born Andreas Cornelis van Kook in the Netherlands, entered the United States illegally, invented a name, invented a rank, and built an empire on the back of a boy from Tupelo who could sing like no one the world had ever heard. Parker was a carnival promoter before he was a music manager, and he never stopped thinking like one. Everything was a show. Everything was a transaction. And on the day Elvis Presley reportedly died, While the rest of the planet buckled under the weight of grief, Colonel Tom Parker did something that tells you everything you need to know about what kind of man he was and what kind of death this might have actually been. Within hours of the announcement, Parker was not mourning. He was on the phone, and he was renegotiating merchandising contracts and restructuring revenue splits with the Presley estate. While Vernon Presley could barely stand upright from the shock, Parker was already calculating how to squeeze profit from the tragedy. And in the middle of one of those calls, he reportedly said something to a stunned associate that has echoed through conspiracy circles ever since. He said, "This changes nothing. It's just like when he went into the Army." Let those words settle in your mind for a moment. Elvis went into the Army in 1958 and came back in 1960. Parker compared Elvis's death to a temporary absence, not to a loss, not to an ending, to a departure with an implied return. Maybe it was just a cold man being callous, or maybe it was a man who knew exactly what had happened because he had helped orchestrate every detail of it. Shelby County Medical Examiner Dr. Jerry Francisco held a press conference shortly after Elvis's body arrived at Baptist Memorial Hospital. He stood in front of cameras and declared the cause of death as cardiac arrhythmia, a heart attack. Clean, simple, final. There was just one glaring problem with that declaration. The toxicology results had not come back yet. Francisco announced a definitive cause of death before the science was even finished. That is not how autopsies work. That is not how any credible medical examiner operates. You do not stand in front of the world and name a cause of death while the lab work that could confirm or contradict you is still being processed. If the autopsy simply confirmed what Francisco told the public, that Elvis died of a heart attack, there would be no reason to hide it. Medical records of public figures are routinely released. The secrecy itself is the confession. Yet whatever is inside that report was dangerous enough that someone decided an entire generation would have to pass before it could see daylight. Then there is the embalming. Elvis's body was prepared with extraordinary speed. The process began before several close family members had even arrived at Graceland, which struck many people as deeply unusual given how tight-knit the Presley family was. But speed served a very specific purpose if the goal was to prevent independent verification. Once a body is pumped full of embalming chemicals and cosmetically altered for presentation, distinguishing real human tissue from high-quality synthetic material becomes enormously difficult, and at least one mortician involved in the preparation later made remarks that have never been fully explained, yet describing the body as not what people expected and calling the entire process unlike anything I had done before or since. Those are not the words of a man who simply prepared a famous corpse for burial. Those are the words of a man carrying a secret he was never quite willing to fully release. If Elvis Presley truly died on August 16th, 1977, then someone needs to explain why thousands of people have seen him in the decades since. And most of those sightings can be dismissed easily. Grieving fans seeing what they desperately wanted to see, lookalikes being mistaken in bad lighting, wishful thinking dressed up as eyewitness testimony, but buried inside that mountain of noise are a handful of encounters that cannot be waved away so simply, encounters that have haunted investigators and believers alike for nearly half a century. In the early 1990s, a home video surfaced that sent shockwaves through the conspiracy community. The footage showed a man standing inside Graceland itself, lingering near the meditation garden where Elvis is supposedly buried. The man appeared to be in his late 50s, which would have matched Elvis's age progression perfectly. His build was right. His posture carried the same distinctive lean that Elvis had displayed his entire life, and witnesses who interacted with him reported a thick Southern accent that sounded exactly like the voice the world had grown up loving. He was not there as part of a tour group. He was simply present, standing near the grave, watching the mourners file past, as if he was studying his own memorial. Then he was gone. No one got his name. No one confirmed his identity. But the footage still exists. And the man in that video has never been identified or explained. Then there is the Kalamazoo sighting. Shortly after the funeral, multiple people in Kalamazoo, Michigan, reported seeing a man matching Elvis's description in locations around the city. What makes this particular sighting compelling is not the description itself, but the location. Elvis had no known connection to Kalamazoo. He never performed there. He never visited publicly. There was no reason for anyone to associate that city with him. And paradoxically, that is exactly what makes it plausible. If you were the most recognizable human being on the planet and you wanted to disappear, you would not go to Memphis or Las Vegas or Los Angeles. You would go somewhere no one would ever think to look for you. You would go somewhere boring and anonymous and completely disconnected from your former life, somewhere like Kalamazoo. But perhaps the most unsettling theory does not involve sightings at all. It involves the United States government. In December 1970, Elvis Presley walked into the White House and met privately with President Richard Nixon. That meeting is one of the most surreal moments in American political history, but what most people do not realize is that Elvis walked out of that meeting with something tangible. He was given an official badge from the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, the agency that would later become the DEA. That badge was not a souvenir. Elvis genuinely wanted to work in drug enforcement, and he wanted to use his access to the entertainment industry to help identify and expose the criminal networks that were flooding America with narcotics. Some researchers believe he actually did it. They believe Elvis became a federal informant, feeding information to law enforcement about organized crime figures operating within the music and film industries. And when those activities put his life in genuine danger, the government offered him the only protection powerful enough to guarantee his safety: a staged death, a new identity, a life in witness protection, completely erased from public existence. It sounds extreme. It sounds like the kind of theory that belongs in fiction rather than reality. But the internal logic is strangely coherent, and no one has ever been able to fully disprove it. And now, for the first time in nearly 50 years, we are approaching a moment that could change everything. Elvis Presley's complete autopsy report has been sealed since 1977. That seal expires in 2027. Not decades from now, months from now. When that document becomes public, we will finally see the unfiltered medical truth about what was lying on that examination table in Memphis. If the autopsy confirms a straightforward death with verified identity, this conspiracy collapses. But if there are anomalies, if there are gaps in the tissue analysis, if there are inconsistencies that cannot be explained, then every theory we have discussed today moves from the fringe into the realm of the credible. The reason this story refuses to die, the reason it persists across generations and continues to captivate millions of people around the world, is not really about mysterious clues found in photographs or inconsistencies regarding caskets and funeral arrangements. At its core, this enduring conspiracy theory is about something far more fundamental and profoundly human. It is about love. Elvis Presley gave the world everything he had to offer. He poured his soul into his music, revolutionized popular culture, broke down social barriers, and touched hundreds of millions of lives with his talent and charisma. He performed until his body failed him, recording and touring relentlessly to satisfy the demands of fans, managers, and the insatiable machinery of fame. He shared his gifts generously and without reservation, asking for nothing more than the chance to entertain and bring happiness to others. And what did he receive in return for this extraordinary gift? A loneliness that no amount of adulation could fill. Exploitation by those who saw him as a commodity rather than a human being. Addiction that developed from legitimate pain management and spiraled into dependency that those around him enabled rather than treated. Isolation behind the gates of Graceland, surrounded by people but profoundly alone. A life that looked glamorous from the outside but was hollow and painful from within. The people who keep this conspiracy alive, who analyze every photograph and scrutinize every detail of his death, are not delusional or disconnected from reality. They are not crazy, despite what skeptics and debunkers might suggest. They simply need to believe that somewhere, somehow, the man who brought them so much joy, who gave them music to fall in love to to grieve to, yet to celebrate to found some joy of his own before the end. They need to believe that Elvis escaped the trap his life had become, that he found peace away from the spotlight, the demands, the exploitation, that he's living quietly somewhere, free from the burdens of being Elvis Presley, finally able to experience the simple pleasures that were denied to him during his years of fame, that his death was staged to give him the one thing he could never have as the king of rock and roll: privacy, autonomy, and genuine human connection, untainted by his celebrity. It's a beautiful fantasy, born not from stupidity but from compassion and the human need to believe that good people eventually find happiness, even if they have to fake their own death to achieve it. In 2027, and if the schedule holds and legal challenges don't further delay the process, we may finally get our definitive answer. The sealed autopsy report, locked away for 50 years by court order to protect privacy and prevent sensationalism, is scheduled to be released. When those documents become public, forensic experts will analyze every detail, comparing the findings to what we know about Elvis's health, his medical history, and the circumstances of his death. But until that autopsy is unsealed and subjected to independent verification, nobody, not the most confident debunker, not the most passionate conspiracy theorist, not the family members who were there, can tell you with absolute certainty who was actually in that casket that sweltering August day in Memphis. Yet nobody has access to the definitive evidence that could settle this question once and for all. Until then, the story lives on, sustained not by evidence, but by hope. Hope that Elvis Presley, who gave so much and suffered so greatly, somehow found his way to peace.